If you went looking for a list of core liberal values, you're going to find a whole bunch of things. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of association, free markets, free trade, free travel, privacy rights, property rights, limited government, equality before the law, consent to the governed. What unites all of these values is a general sense of openness as good. In Karl Popper's foundational liberal text, The Open Society and Its Enemies, he defends these liberal values and the open society they've created from reactionary, socialist, and fascist critiques, all three of whom reject at least some component of liberal openness in favor of unlimited state power in the political realm, or autarky in the economic realm, or censorship in the social realm. These policies are not exclusively left or right wing, but they are all isolationist rather than open. Despite being a liberal myself, I recognize that Popper's ideas are not without their flaws. This notion of openness as good has its own downsides, which I intend to explore in future videos. But in general, the open society has been more good than bad. The liberal, capitalist, democratic world order is probably the best civilization in human history. And if we're going to talk about the individual liberties that civilization rests upon, one of the most important ones is the concept of consent. When people casually talk about consent, they're usually talking about sex. But more generally, consent is the voluntary choice of one individual agreeing to the proposal of another individual. I've done several videos on different aspects of consent over the years: sexual consent, medical consent, legal consent, informed consent. But rather than making you watch a whole bunch of other stuff before we continue this conversation, I'll include a quick breakdown here. Because consent is an agreement between two people, and if there is an exchange involved that needs to be upheld somehow, consent can be codified into a contract, where your signature on the dotted line is a sign that you consent to the contents of the contract. For example, if the owner of a shop wants to hire you, he's trading his money for your labor, you're trading your labor for his money. If you both agree to the ratio of labor to money, you both sign the contract, and then if one of you violates the agreement, the contract provides recourse through the legal system. This is the liberal view of consent as it interacts with capitalism, and anybody who's worked a job knows what I'm saying.
Fair wages for fair work.
Fair wages for fair work.
The socialist critique of this state of affairs is that it's not truly consensual on behalf of the worker. If the negotiation between any one worker and a shop owner breaks down, the shop owner can simply hire the next guy who comes along, since to him, individual workers aren't really individuals. They are only the work they provide, and so economically speaking, they are simply fungible labor units. But if the worker doesn't get the job, he has no money coming in, and he risks eviction, homelessness, and starvation. Most libertarians claim that capitalism is entirely voluntary, because there's no state enforcer pointing its weapons at individuals and forcing them to work, unlike various socialist, fascist, and monarchist regimes. But the common socialist reply to this claim is that starvation is the gun to your head. It's the socialist point of view that there can never truly be consent between employer and employee, because the power imbalance between the two means the worker is always coerced into signing the contract. This poses a problem for the concept of consent. Remember, consent is a voluntary agreement for one person to fulfill the proposal of another person. If I were to actually point a gun at you and force you to sign a labor contract, we all agree that's not actual consent even though you signed it. It's not voluntary, it's coercive. The socialists are correct when they recognize that a worker who faces starvation, if he doesn't agree to work, is under some level of duress. The boss might not be forcing him to sign at gunpoint, but the boss is exploiting the worker's circumstances in order to get him to accept a lesser deal, so fair enough. However, the problem with the socialist view on consent is that it necessarily destroys the very concept of negotiation. There will always be some level of power imbalance between two opposing parties that are negotiating something, because no two factions in a conflict are ever truly perfectly equal. There will always be a weaker and stronger party. The weaker party will have less resources to negotiate with. They will have a greater need to cut a deal. And so, from the socialist point of view, they will always be coerced on some level into signing an agreement, even if only a little bit. If any form of coercion invalidates consent, as the socialists believe, then negotiation between opposing groups is always impossible because consent can never truly be given. The liberal view of consent rejects this socialist view by separating out active coercion by another party from circumstantial coercion as a result of context or environment. Though this view of consent, that it can't be given unless the two parties are equals, began as a socialist idea, it nonetheless informs a lot of other progressive discourse on the topic. Understanding this framework allows us to explain why progressives tend to disproportionately place the burden of responsible activity on straight white men, while excusing even the most heinous actions of non-straights, non-whites, and non-men. In much the same vein, radical feminists of the early 2010s commonly said that women cannot rape men because men wield power, and rape is an act of power. If women lack institutional power as a class, then women cannot be rapists. Some of them even said that women just can't consent to sex with men for the same reason: power dynamics. This schema has been used to judge other consensual sexual encounters as actually being non-consensual due to the power imbalance between the two people involved. The age gap discourse that keeps reappearing on Twitter repeatedly is a prime example of this, implying that these relationships aren't truly consensual because by progressive sensibilities they can't be. This was lampooned by the right-wing cartoonist Stone Toss, who basically just repurposed a previous meme lambasting Christian conservatives who believed the same thing but from the other direction. Horseshoe theory is always correct, guys. The reason both of these images are constantly reposted is because the idea that consensual contact between two adults is somehow non-consensual due to an uninvolved third party injecting their moral judgment into the situation is absurdly funny because it violates one of those core liberal principles, the right to privacy. If an unmarried couple, or two gay men, or Leonardo DiCaprio and a 19-year-old model decide to have sex in the privacy of their own house, it is both stupid and infringing for a third party to look in at them through the window and go, I don't consent to this, because frankly, it's just none of their business. The wildest example of this type of policing of privacy by a moral busybody that I've seen online was when a person had pornographic furry artwork hung up in their house and was told by this random idiot that they were pedophiles because a kid might be walking by and see it through their window. Yeah, the furries might be kind of weird sometimes, but these Puritans always default to think of the children, because literally no other logic will get them to their desired end goal of policing someone's private life. The former Prime Minister of Canada, Pierre Trudeau, said it the best.
It's bringing the laws of the land up to contemporary society, I think. Take this thing on homosexuality. I think the view we take here is that there's no place for the state in the bedrooms of the nation, and I think that, what's done in private between adults doesn't concern the criminal code.
Privacy is one of those liberal values that is constantly attacked by anti-liberals on all sides. Right-wingers tend to disagree with the liberal conception of privacy, as articulated by Trudeau and others like him. They decry his view, and more generally the separation of church and state, as the privatization of Christianity, an action that drove Christian morals out of the public sphere, the political sphere, and into the personal sphere, the private sphere. And to their credit, there are some problems that have come with that for sure, like the lack of an overarching society-wide ethic, which can foster unity between strangers. So fair enough. But a Christianity that is non-privatized is a Christianity that peers into your private life, with the power and authority of the state, and tells you that what you do in your bedroom is not solely a private matter, but it is of interest to the general public. And that type of intrusion does not stop with the criminalization of homosexuality. If you want examples of this in action, all you have to do is look at the behaviors of religious morality police in various Islamic countries. I oppose the Christian nationalists for the same reason I oppose the Islamists. Religion is best left as a private affair, and making it a matter of the state opens the door to widespread tyranny.
And I'm tired of this separation of church and state junk that's not in the Constitution. It was in a stinking letter, and it means nothing like what they say it does.
The First Amendment, which is probably the most well-known part of the Constitution, directly covers establishment of religion. And the so-called stinking letter she's talking about are the Federalist Papers, which the Supreme Court routinely refers to in their judgments, in order to understand what America's founding fathers intended when they wrote the Constitution. For example, Thomas Jefferson wrote, "It does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg." James Madison wrote, "The federal government is open to merit of every description, whether native or adoptive, whether young or old, and without regard to poverty or wealth, or to any particular profession or religious faith." Whether Lauren Barbie here thinks it's good or not, a government that forces Christianity on its citizens is anti-American. However, left-wingers often disagree with this liberal conception of privacy as well. No, not simply by naively being pro-Islam, because it's just this beautiful native culture performed by innocent brown people who have never done anything wrong. No, also in terms of consensual sexual practices, like the age gap stuff, but more commonly in the realm of economics again. In their view, because workers cannot consent to sell their labor to their boss, the relationship between worker and boss is a public and political affair, not a private and personal one. Landlords and tenants, same thing. Tenants cannot truly consent to rent housing. Therefore, the rest of society has a stake in their agreement, despite not being party to it. Same thing with consumption habits and ecological concerns. If you're driving around in a gas-guzzling car, if you're eating a lot of meat, if you throw out tons of plastic, whatever, your consumption negatively affects the rest of the world. And so the rest of the world has a say in your consumption habits.
I have a permit. This just says I can do what I want.
I understand this critique, but I also understand that in practice, they behave almost identically to the right-wingers, objecting to the privatization of Christianity, and I oppose them for similar reasons. In both of these cases, what's happening is, the liberal is being told, your consent is not enough to make this action moral. And once again, fair enough. We can absolutely think of instances where this hyper-individualistic view of consent can lead to bad outcomes. Case in point, actual addicts. If an alcoholic or a drug user or a porn addict consents to continuously use his vice of choice, and he completely destroys his life, however, he doesn't hurt anybody else in the process, he's not attacking anybody or anything, the damage of his self-destruction is only limited to himself, is that moral? Whenever I talk about this sort of thing, I use this meme, a comic panel commonly reposted on the right, where an addict completely destroys his life indulging in vices. The normal guy says this is kinda weird, and he's told, OMG, let people enjoy things. The The point here is that although no one's consent is being violated in this picture, it still intuitively feels immoral to us, because consent isn't the only moral concern. The reply from conservatives or reactionaries is that feeling of discomfort tells us something must be done about this. Now, sometimes something actually must be done. For example, every time you see a public sidewalk littered with homeless drug addicts, simply appealing to that live and let live moral principle is not going to work, because this is a public space that these guys are shitting up. Listen, I know progressives want walkable cities, but I don't want to walk down the street if it's full of these burnout losers with needles hanging out of their arms. In the public domain, the public sphere of life, there actually should be some moral standard that we have to abide by, beyond simply to each his own. We are not isolated islands, with no connection or responsibility to our fellow man. However, in the private domain, things are different, and they should be, because we're all individuals with different tolerances and proclivities. What is good for one person might not be good for another. Yeah, sure, in a general sense, we all require the same basic stuff. We all need food and water, for example. Human biology means we have a lot in common. To reuse an example from a previous video, if your average person has a headache, a quick and easy response is to give him ibuprofen, because although you don't really know if it'll work on him until you try it, considering that ibuprofen works on most people most of the time, it's a safe bet. However, if a person has an ibuprofen allergy, obviously you don't give him ibuprofen. The point here is that although we have a general idea of what most people need most of the time, the specifics always differ from person to person. The baseline is just that, a baseline, and sometimes you need to deviate away from it. The bog standard conservative life advice of graduate from school, get married to a member of the opposite sex, have kids, work hard at your job, it's good advice for most people. Progressives might complain that it's too heteronormative or whatever, but if you set the majority of people on this track, they'll actually have a decent life. The conservative philosopher Edmund Burke described this outlook in his essay, Reflections on the French Revolution. Burke wrote, "We are generally men of untaught feelings. Instead of casting away all our old prejudices, we cherish them to a very considerable degree. We are afraid to put men to live and trade, each on his own private stock of reason, because we suspect that this stock in each man is small, and that individuals would do better to avail themselves of the general bank and capital of nations and ages. Many of our men of speculation, instead of exploding general prejudices, employ their sagacity to discover the latent wisdom which prevails them. If they find what they seek, and they seldom fail, they think it more wise to continue the prejudice, with the reason involved, than to cast away the coat of prejudice and to leave nothing but the naked reason, because prejudice, with its reason, has a motive to give action to that reason, and an affection which will give it permanence." Now, Burke is using language from 1790, so this sounds a little bit weird to us today. When he says prejudice, he doesn't mean to be hateful towards a minority or something. He's talking about an irrational, subjective preference. And I don't use irrational negatively here. For example, if you prefer sweet food over salty food, you didn't come to that preference rationally. Your taste is your own. It's no better or worse than anyone else's. It's simply a subjective difference with no moral weight attached. But more importantly than food, for Burke, prejudice also refers to the irrational, subjective love of various cultural practices. So, what he's saying in this passage is that these men of untaught feelings, meaning men who simply have an intuitional preference, they think it's bad when individuals live and trade on their own private stock of reason because that stock is small, meaning that individuals actually aren't all that smart a lot of the time. And so these individuals should rely on the wisdom of nations and ages, meaning their traditions that have been handed down to them and tested by time. These men of speculation discover and follow the latent wisdom within these traditions, and because there's an emotional connection to the traditions, on account of them being of their culture and therefore familiar, these men are more likely to do good things, because having a good rationale to do a thing is not as motivating as having a good rationale and a positive emotional connection. To really put this in layman's terms, nobody is smart enough to rationally reconstruct the entire knowledge of a functioning civilization on their own. Therefore, when it comes to the well-trodden paths, most people should actually just do what everyone else does. If you don't know what to do with your life, do the basics. Graduate from school, get a job, get married, have kids, contribute to your community in some way. Nearly every society has solved these problems, and most people would live a pretty good life if they simply adopted most of the solutions handed down to them by their traditions. You don't gotta reinvent the wheel every time. However, there are individuals who truly just are wired differently, such that for them, they actually shouldn't have kids, or they shouldn't get married to a member of the opposite sex. For those people, on these points, the conservative's advice doesn't apply. That doesn't mean the conservative advice is bad. It is a good starting point, but it does mean that sometimes an individual might have to break out of that mold. This is why I believe the liberal concept of a public-private split is the best solution we've come across to solving this tension between individualistic conceptions of consent versus the collective public good. If you tilt too far in the direction of the collective, you have an overbearing, sometimes totalitarian society breathing down your neck, demanding everyone conform to every facet of normalcy. But if you tilt too far in the direction of the individual, you end up with a street full of degenerates doing the fent bent, and no one doing anything about it, because hey, they're not hurting anybody. Them shitting at the sidewalk doesn't actually affect you, even though you have to look at it and walk through it, and you don't get to enjoy a well-maintained, common community space. There's clearly a balance that needs to be struck between these two extremes, and the liberal solution of creating two different spheres of human activity, where public and private conduct each has their place, allows us to resolve this tension. In recent years, the progressives have tilted us too far in the individualist direction, at least in some ways. Meanwhile, the reactionaries are currently in the process of forcing things back in the other direction, but they're also going too far. Neither of them actually respect the idea that the public and the private should be considered separate domains, which is a big reason why they're both anti-liberal. Meanwhile, it's my view that, generally speaking, governments should be liberal and people should be conservative. At least as conservative as is reasonably possible. Individuals would do well to adhere to the traditions of their culture where they can. Not for any sort of moralistic reason, like you're somehow better if you do and worse if you don't or something, but because on a practical level, those traditions mostly just work. And on the other hand, the government should be liberal, because that is how the right of the individual to break out of the mold of their traditions when necessary is safeguarded. This is why I'm a liberal, but not a progressive. I don't believe in some sort of telos of history, where the more left-wing everything gets, the more good or moral it is. Rather, I'm a liberal, because of all the political ideologies floating around right now, socialist, fascist, reactionary, monarchist, anarchist, progressive, it's really only liberalism that simultaneously allows for a public domain where the common good is respected and communities are given their due, alongside a private domain where individuals are free to break the rules and forge their own paths and lives. The liberal era is the only time in human history where we've managed to strike a pretty good balance between freedom and order, and we dismantle it at our own peril. Thanks for watching, guys. If this video looked or sounded familiar, that's because it's actually a chapter from my 4.5-hour video essay on the collective shout drama from back in the summer of 2025. That video ended up getting nuked because its content was kinda spicy, but the link on screen should allow you to watch the whole thing. And I'd love it if you did. I think it's actually my best work, even though it is about a bunch of feminists and tradcons dogpiling a porn game in order to get it taken off of Steam. It's my view that porn is the canary in the coal mine when it comes to liberal freedoms being snuffed out, which is why a lot of that video is actually about the philosophy, not the porn. Anyway, please consider watching it, and I will see you guys next time. Have a good one. I love you.